I suspect that all knitters, whether they knit by hand or by machine, have at some point struggled with yarn management. Yarn that tangles, yarn that wanders around the room, yarn that adopts seemingly interdimensional topologies hitherto unknown to science. I can't even count how many hours of airline travel I've expected to spend knitting that instead ended up dedicated to rewinding yarn that somehow regurgitated itself while I was going through security. If you know, you know. Yarns meant for hand knitting come in lots of different formats, from hanks to skeins to donuts. But these are commonly rewound into balls or cakes, which keeps the yarn in a compact, manageable arrangement. So whether you knit from the center or the outside of the ball, either way there will be some variation in the feeding rate and tension, which could affect the final gauge. But a hand knitter has lots of manual control and discretion to compensate, adding or removing slack as they create the stitches. In general, machine knitting magnifies the problem of yarn management, in part because of the speeds involved. You might be chewing through feet or meters of yarn per second. Because the stitches are forming so fast, the operator, if one is present, might not be able to react in time to fix tension variations or tangles before they get out of hand, which can lead to lost time fixing errors, permanent flaws in the fabric, or even damage to the machine. Okay, bear with me for a second. I'm gonna go off on a bit of a tangent here, but machines, by which I mean machines in general, not knitting machines specifically, aren't actually smart. Don't believe the marketing copy. They don't actually think for themselves, even if it sometimes seems like it. The thinking was done far in advance by humans. What I'm getting at here is that if you're designing a system that you want to be able to autonomously do something meaningful with a stream of input from the messy real world, you need to be able to make predictions about what that input is going to be like. One way to approach this is to try to engineer a system which is honestly really complicated, to be able to respond to lots of variations in your predicted inputs. Or you can make the machine relatively simple, but you have to enforce rigid rules about how varied the input is allowed to be. Technology is largely a manifestation of somebody else's assumptions about what should be considered predictable and normal in a particular set of circumstances. That's why sometimes a computer will tell someone that their own name is invalid. Okay, back to knitting. Yarn is our input here, and as we discussed earlier, when it's left to its own devices, yarn is kind of a messy little bitch with a grudge against you personally and humanity generally. For some types of domestic flatbed knitting, yarn wound into cakes can work well enough, especially if you're willing to pause between rows to make adjustments. But on the circular sock machine, you might be cranking continuously for dozens of rounds, and the seemingly small variations in tension that might occur when pulling from a cake or ball can spiral out of control pretty quickly. So for circular or higher speed machine use, yarns are usually wound onto cones. This format allows the yarn to unspool smoothly and continuously from the outer surface of the cone with very little, and importantly, very predictable tension. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of printing and building this project, let's talk about what it can do, what it can't, and what it's like to use.
Get in, loser. We're going on a journey.
So, way back when my household first got a 3D printer, I was excited to print a circular sock knitting machine. I knew from my weeks of anticipatory obsessive rabbit holing that I'd need to wind my sock yarn onto cones in order to knit with it. But when I looked around for cone winding tools, I didn't really find what I was looking for. So I thought, hey, I've got a 3D printer now. I want to learn 3D modeling. I will design and build a cone winder. And amazingly, I did somehow, despite being quite disorganized, using a wildly inappropriate CAD tool relative to the complexity of the project, and honestly being in kind of over my head engineering-wise, I managed to come up with a tool that pretty much did what I needed it to do. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, it was kind of a pain in the ass to put together, but by gosh, it wound some frickin' nice looking cones. Fast forward a couple of years, I start to feel like I've picked up some hard-fought lessons on the sock machine that seem worth sharing, and I make a YouTube video about it. I mention that I wind my cones using this homemade cone winder. This video of me making a sock unexpectedly becomes by far the most watched thing on my channel, and I start getting comments about the cone winder. Are the files available? Where can I get the files? Another vote for the cone winder. And at first, I'm excited by this. There's something really invigorating about people's enthusiasm for a thing I've made, and if I've created something useful, I want to... Nay, I am honor-bound to share it. Yes, I say, I'll try to release the cone winder. And I think this is where things started to go wrong. In late October 2024, I dig up the long dormant design files. They're in Tinkercad. That made sense at the time, I guess. There are multiple instances of everything spread across several files with no version control or documentation to speak of. I don't really want to start over from scratch, but I believe there are, just a few small changes I could make to polish it up. I begin consolidating, tweaking. I'm redesigning parts so they'll print more efficiently. I'm considering how to make it foolproof to assemble. I'm writing a draft of a script and planning a demo. I'm ready to print the improved machine. I break my foot and can't safely access the 3D printer for weeks. When I'm finally mobile enough again, I begin clomping up and down the stairs in my fracture boot, clambering onto my work table to set up the overhead camera, struggling to make the most of the dwindling December daylight. But this assembly demo is an unsalvageable disaster. I am kind of a disaster. A part breaks. Design imitating life, I guess. I need to remodel it and reprint it, but more annoyingly, I need to dig the broken piece out first in order to replace it, which I know sounds trivial, but the stub of the part which sheared off is glued into a spinning bearing, so there's no real way to get a grip on it, and this simple task, takes most of a day. Months pass in which I write and rewrite the script in between other tasks and major life events, shuffling paragraphs around looking for the magic sequence of words that will accurately convey the many limitations of this project. I can identify lots of ways that it could be better, faster, more robust, more user-friendly. I can also feel the chill of all the shadowy, unknowable ways it will disappoint people that I hadn't even foreseen. The document becomes so thick with disclaimers that reading to the end feels like walking against a current, and it's tough to imagine who would even watch to the end of that video, let alone still want the machine after that. In trying to set realistic expectations, I nearly convinced myself it's not worth releasing at all. My trusty original winder is in pieces, sacrificed to harvest hardware for the new model. The ostensibly improved machine squeaks. And I am tired. I begin to question who and what I'm doing this for. I can't stop thinking about this quote. The explorer who will not come back or send back his ships to tell his tale is not an explorer, only an adventurer. So listen, I fuck around a lot because, I'm curious. I just sort of bumble around my environment collecting little tidbits of information until I accidentally unlock special interest mode and oops, now I need to read everything there is to read about homebrewing gluten-free beer. Or I'm downloading 19th century shoemaking manuals from archive.org, up at 2 a.m. watching a dozen videos about compliant mechanisms. And in these quests, I tend to rely pretty heavily on the generosity of others, following in the footsteps of strangers who've shared everything from little tiny breadcrumbs to entire maps of the territory. And the incomplete fragments and
ballads of failure are often just as useful as the triumphant successes or the meticulous instructions. And so if I've used these resources to solve some problem or even just satisfy some curiosity, I do feel like I should be contributing back to this commons. I want my fucking around to help somebody else find out. Otherwise it feels a little selfish, or frivolous, extractive even.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but doesn't the commons deserve, I don't know, good contributions? There's already so much misinformation and slop out there. I just gotta wonder if maybe I'm not actually helping anyone by being another confidently wrong, mediocre asshole just sowing pretty weeds in place of useful crops. I can't find the original source anymore, but I recently saw someone commenting on those little disclaimers at the bottom of LLM responses, ChatGPT and stuff. The fine print that's oh, I'm just a silly chatbot and I get things wrong all the time. Don't forget to double check everything I tell you, even though I was sold to you as an omniscient god. And, I'm paraphrasing, but this person was basically we all deserve better than a product that makes excuses for its own insufficiency. When you look something up, don't you deserve to be given the right answer? And I don't know, lately I'm kind of worried that's me. Hello, I'm the insufficient product. I know something about a lot of things, but I'm not an expert in anything, including building a cone winder. I'm an amateur, a dilettante. I am an enthusiastic dipshit. And, I don't actually want to hide that. I actually think it's really important that we get on the same page about that before you pick up anything I offer you. Yeah, for sure. I believe I should be transparent about my limitations in the name of intellectual humility. But if I can't, put my whole chest into it when saying, here's this thing I made, then I don't know, why am I bothering offering it at all? Sure, but anything worth doing is worth half-assing, isn't it? If I let the perfect be the enemy of the good, then I'll never finish anything. I will never share anything. And maybe I shouldn't. Then what am I for? If you're watching this in the future, first of all, glad to hear there is one. Doesn't always feel like a foregone conclusion right now. Second, the mood I'm describing probably makes the most sense if I situate you in time a little bit. See, it's spring of 2025.
Okay, well, it was spring when I started this, but things got out of hand.
And everything is just so deeply stupid, cruel, and exhausting. I won't even try to get into all the ambient human rights horrors, the multiple ongoing genocides, the climate catastrophes. I want to scream into a pillow most of the time, and obviously that's not very conducive to a healthy and productive state of mind, nor should it be, to be honest. Anyway, I'll try to keep this context scoped to the landscape of knowledge work and creative labor right now. You see, I am a recent-ish university graduate, a midlife career hopper in the uncomfortable position of being both too junior and too old for this shit. I feel like I'm bombarded pretty regularly with signals from execs and my would-be peers in the field of computing that maybe there's not really a place for me in the world which I just spent years of my life studying to join. To recap, Big Tech has just enacted yet another round of devastating layoffs accompanied by reports of massive profits, alongside transparently bullshit sound bites from the same executives who brag in puff profiles about how they outsource even their shower thoughts to large language models. It's the vapid future of daydreaming, Get on board or get left behind. Another giant company has just announced their hot new plan to reinvent and privatize the bus. Again. The halls of power are clogged with wealthy techno-solutionists who are hostile to the very idea that they might be ever asked to learn anything from anyone with more experience than them, and everywhere I look, the market seems to be rewarding yet another extractive pump-and-dump vaporware grifter with a 7-figure salary bump, all while the artists, scientists, and educators have their funding and mandates stripped for parts. Lives are being ruined, culture is being pillaged, and the mere mention of the name David Zaslav gives me a migraine. Big Tech has just enacted yet another round of devastating layoffs accompanied by reports of massive profits. Yeah, that's not an editing mistake. They just fucking did it again before I could finish the script. So I've been disillusioned with jobs before, but I don't think I've ever felt so alienated from the very concept of a meaningful career. When I look around at what actually gets rewarded, I genuinely don't feel like I know what a good use of my time is these days. I know I'm not interested in just making a number go up somewhere. I know I don't want to add to the avalanche of bullshit in your life. So it's in the midst of all this disorientation and despair that I'm left sitting here, pondering my imperfect, intractable project, realizing that it's not making me happy, and wondering how it fits into this big picture. I'm left asking, what do I, as a creator, owe you, the world, myself? In the who cares era, is this how I want to spend my time? Or to suggest that you spend yours, flaws and all? I think one of the reasons I feel so paralyzed by this particular project at this particular time is maybe that it kind of occupies a weird gray area between categories at a time when several parties, bankers, a couple of governments, my family members, have been asking me what my occupation is these days, which is likewise in a weird gray area.
What would you say you do here?
As a result, this project pushes itself into this little gap in my various potential personas, widening and highlighting this crack in my identity. It feels like a lightning rod for context collapse. It may be tempting to chalk all of my hand-wringing up to perfectionism or imposter syndrome. You wouldn't be entirely wrong either. But there's something about this one that does feel somehow different than my usual slog through the creative valley of suckitude. I think there's maybe more to this story than just my own anxiety. And so I want to take this opportunity to unpack some of the uneasy tensions I've found in trying to create for the web right now. Let's use the cone winder to explore what it is I should say I do here. So there's a lot of really well-meaning cliches aimed at creative people to help us get unstuck when faced with hangups like mine. Like, done is better than perfect. Quantity leads to quality. Make a crap first draft. Don't worry about what other people think. And you know what? A lot of this advice has been genuinely helpful to me before. I'll probably have to leverage just about all of it in order to eventually just get over myself and stop editing this video. So I'm not here to tell you it's nonsense or anything, but I've been having a hard time applying it to this project. Why? Well, at the risk of opening up a small can of worms, this isn't art. It's design. And art and design are different if overlapping creative fields with different goals. For example, in his video about what he calls the fuck-up philosophy, Campbell Walker, aka Struthless, proposes a creative exercise in which we combat perfectionism by making something kind of terrible on purpose. He demonstrates by mocking up a bad t-shirt. I think we're meant to understand that the graphic is bad in that neither the effort invested into the creative process nor the end result really live up to Cam's usual standards as an artist. It's ugly, and that's okay. Freeing, even. So fair enough. But I've made my fair share of clothing over the years, and I gotta ask, was it actually a bad shirt? I mean, like many fields that straddle art and design,
Fashion has to balance and blend aesthetic with utility. You might design or wear a garment to express yourself, sure, but it also needs to, be a shirt. It has a function. If Cam had produced a shirt that's not wearable, now that's a bad shirt. That's bad design. As far as I can tell, this was a real item for sale in his merch shop for a limited time, so I'm going to assume that the actual shirt part of the design was almost certainly outsourced to a mass manufacturer, and that anyone who bought it received a usable, if unapologetically tacky, item of clothing. And part of the reason that I feel fairly confident in that assumption is that it's just sort of a baseline expectation for designed products we buy that by the time they reach us, they'll be more or less fit for the purpose they're marketed toward. We expect that the crap first draft thing happened behind the scenes, and the version we're getting will just work. And if it doesn't, we're justifiably gonna complain about it. It just works seems to be a favorite shorthand for good design, especially in the tech industry. Steve Jobs was famously fond of describing new Apple products this way.
And so everything happens automatically, and there's nothing new to learn. It just all works. It just works.
Or consider Google.
Well, when you use Google, do you get more than one answer? Of course you do.
Yeah, of course.
Well, that's a bug. We should be able to give you the right answer just once. We should know what you meant. You should look for information. We should give it exactly right, and we should give it to you in your language. And we should never be wrong. That's our challenge.
So user experience designers tend to value ease, seamlessness, consistency, universality, and saving time. Or at least not wasting it, anticipating what the user will need before they know it themselves. UX, I think, is strongly associated with software, but it also applies to physical goods and, well, experiences. Can I honestly say the Cone Winders succeeds on those fronts? Granted, I am one independent goofball and not, say, the largest company in the world by market cap, but this is, I think, what we're all encouraged to expect, and in the case of designers, to aspire to. Perhaps this is what I feel I failed at, not just a failure to execute, but a failure to even aspire. So yeah, when I'm making something to express my ideas or emotions, then I mean, sure, fuck the haters. I'm allowed to boldly suck at this as much as I want to. You're entitled to your opinions, but I don't need to defend or apologize for my creative choices just because they weren't to your taste.
I don't feel that I need to explain my art to you, Warren.
If I'm sharing something that I expect others will use, though, something that's intended to provide a solution or to make some task easier, should I be thinking like a designer? Should I be judging that work on a different rubric? I do kind of feel like there are some best practices of design that are hard to reconcile with some of that artist-focused advice, like, don't worry what other people will think. At the very least, design is a user-centered endeavor. You probably shouldn't say, fuck the haters, because the haters might actually be the very people whose problem you were trying to solve. Oh, but that's the thing. In this case, I didn't set out to solve your problems. I set out to solve mine. I may be trying to make the result available to you, but I didn't make it for you. The Cone Winder started out as a personal project to address the needs of an audience of one. And I want to stress that in that context, I don't think it's a failure. I'm proud of solving this problem for myself. I could not wind a cone of yarn before, and now I can, and for me, that's good enough. But of course, good enough choices for me may look different than good enough choices at a large scale. For example, as an individual, when I was building the original cone winder for myself, I could improvise an assembly method on the fly, and it didn't really matter to me if it was inefficient or imprecise or frustrating, or if I wrote any of the steps down. As long as I got it to a working state eventually, it only really had to come together once. I cannot stress enough how much I, as one individual human, do not need more than one cone winder at this time in my life. I never needed to build it again. But you, en masse, might build it
a dozen or 100 or 1,000 times. I actually have no idea. I might feel a little delinquent if I don't make a good faith effort to provide some sort of assembly instructions, ideally ones that are clear, precise, and hopefully hard to mess up. This in turn demands changes to the design, especially dialing in the way different parts fit together so there's less ambiguity about alignment or orientation, which leads to more printing, more testing, more iterations, more time, more filament, more delays. I haven't been working on it nonstop or anything, but that's most of what I was trying to do with it since last fall. Not make a better cone winder, but just to get this one to a state where I could confidently tell you how to build it and how to use it. So how far does this go in making the design available to you? How obligated am I to try to make it for you? Because how to build it was the easy part to improve. How to use it is, well, let's take a look at a few of the usability quirks of this thing that I suspect may not have universal appeal. 1, winding a cone is pretty slow. It's probably faster than trying to do it by hand with no tools at all. And of course, speed isn't necessarily the only or even the most important criterion to be assessed, but it's not going to be nearly as quick as motorized winding tools, which definitely do exist, or even hand-cranked tools that use, gear ratios or whatever to better advantage. 2, setup and use is not very intuitive. Even as its maker, I had to do a fair bit of experimentation and practice to get consistently good results. That technique emerges from the mechanical demands of the machine rather than the way a human naturally moves. Ideally, it should be the other way around. 3, it requires both hands to operate. And perhaps most damningly, 4, it requires sustained focus from the user. So these grooves on the barrel will help guide the yarn onto the cone in a nice organized pattern, but they won't catch the yarn very well on their own unless you actively direct the strand at least vaguely in the right direction. So you have to pay attention. Now, industrial yarn winding drums handle this very differently, and they're the subject of actually a lot of engineering research and development, as far as I can tell. I spent half a summer overheating my brain trying to figure out how to make something similar from scratch before accepting that, I'm fine with this, actually. Maybe one of you will have better luck than I did, but it does seem like most of the other indie or DIY winding projects I've seen incorporate ready-made drum components purchased from industrial suppliers rather than rolling their own like I did. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but since I was only planning to make one of these, I just didn't really want to mess around with international shipping and minimum order quantities and all of that business. In a nutshell, this is a tool that demands a lot from its user. A lot of learning, energy, and presence for a task that I think a lot of us just probably really don't want to invest that much in. So I can identify these issues, and I can even imagine ways to potentially address them. But unfortunately, none of those potential solutions really exist within the framework of what I've already done. There doesn't seem to be a clear path from the original personal cone winder to a more user-friendly one that feels ready to meet the public. If I were developing a product rather than trying to share something I'd already made, then this would probably be just one of an assortment of prototypes, and now would be the time to try something radically different. But this is no longer a question of polishing a rough first draft, but of needing to write a different, more marketable story altogether. At the end of The Design of Everyday Things, author Don Norman waxes somewhat optimistic about the rise of the small, a renaissance of individual talent enabled by increasingly available technologies. Today, anyone in the world can create, design, and manufacture. Design is a powerful equalizing tool. All that is needed is observation, creativity, and hard work. Anyone can do it. With open source software, inexpensive open source 3D printers, and even open source education, we can transform the world.
The book more or less ends on this uplifting, hopeful note, one which I personally really want to embrace. But I have to say that I have a little bit of trouble reconciling that vision with, like, a lot of the rest of the text. Now, before I dissect that thought, I just want to pause for a second and say I'm going to critique a few ideas, but overall I actually really liked this book. I'm a lot less enthusiastic than Norman seems to be when it comes to some of his near-future predictions like self-driving cars and AI and facial recognition, but the design of everyday things is full of, I thought, very insightful, compassionate ways of thinking about the built environment. And on the whole, I probably got a lot more out of this book than any of the several rather expensive textbooks I had to buy for my undergrad interaction design course.
Just always seem to open the book with these examples of good design that sound kind of insane to me. I don't know, do you not get PMS butterfingers? I would lose those marbles so fast, man.
Plus, I found it was just a genuinely fun read, and I'm looking forward to checking out some of his other books. With that said, although Norman does include examples of non-commercial design scenarios throughout the book, some domestic or personal, like arranging furniture around a home or organizing items in a kitchen, and a fair bit about safety systems, the dominant, overwhelming backdrop to a lot of the discussion is product design, as in stuff you're gonna sell.
The viewpoint of the business is also important, because it does not matter how wonderful the product is if not enough people buy it. If a product does not sell, the company must often stop producing it, even if it is a great product.
I found that this theme was even stronger in Cliff Kwong and Robert Fabricant's book, User-Friendly, How the Hidden Rules of Design Are Changing the Way We Live, Work, and Play. Design is the domain of consumerism, and sometimes war, but mostly business. Anyway, hang tight, we'll circle back to these folks in a bit. Norman spends some time describing gold standard research and development processes that involve what sounds to me like quite a lot of resources. But even when he's not proposing, say, weeks of international travel for the design team to understand the activities of your global user base in their home environments, a lot of the book's points are at least implicitly framed through the priorities, hierarchies, and, of course, the budgets of business. For example, he writes frequently throughout the book about the importance of multidisciplinary design teams. And just a few pages before that Rise of the Small section I quoted, he enumerates how many different roles are involved in creating, say, a professional piece of multimedia.
Amateurs can do a 5 or 10-minute video, but anything beyond that requires superb editing skills.
Why, thank you.
Moreover, there has to be a writer, a camera person, a recording person, and a lighting person. There has to be a director to coordinate these activities and to select the best approach to each scene. A skilled editor is required to piece the segments together. An electronic book on the environment, Al Gore's interactive media book Our Choice, lists a large number of job titles for the people responsible for this one book. Publishers, 2 people, editor, production director, production editor, and production supervisor. Software architect, user interface engineer, interactive graphics, animations, graphics design, photo editor, video editors, 2, videographer, music, and cover designer. What is the future of the book? Very expensive. The advent of new technologies is making books, interactive media, and all sorts of educational and recreational material more effective and pleasurable. Each of the many tools makes creation easier. As a result, we will see a proliferation of materials. Most will be amateurish, incomplete, and somewhat incoherent. But even amateur productions can serve valuable functions in our lives, as the immense proliferation of homemade videos available on the internet demonstrate. But for high-quality professional material that tells a coherent story in a way that is reliable, where the facts have been checked and the message authoritative, where the material will flow, experts are needed. The mix of technologies and tools makes quick and rough creation easier, but polished and professional-level material much more difficult. The society of the future, something to look forward to with pleasure, contemplation, and dread.
Now, I actually don't think Norman is wrong to highlight the huge variety of skills that go into making things that feel deceptively simple to use or to consume, which we might otherwise take for granted. Pulling off something thoughtful and polished does take a lot of effort, knowledge, time, and yeah, sometimes money. So I feel that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the future is expensive and the future is open source that he doesn't quite manage to bridge. And although the book doesn't spend a lot of time on this, I actually think there's a pretty interesting and maybe kind of urgent story to be told here about design's role in the tug of war between ideas of democratizing and de-skilling formerly specialized labor. What do we gain and what do we lose when, say, a little hyper-focused goblin like me has access to rapid prototyping tools and distribution methods, but like a little bit decontextualized from their original culture of expertise? Or what about when someone can solo vibe code their way to shipping insecure and unreliable production software they do not understand in order to disrupt a domain they don't deeply understand? Or when the aesthetic signifiers of authoritative media are increasingly achievable on a shoestring budget, and the signifiers of raw authenticity become more valuable to businesses as a result. So you, the viewer, can no longer readily distinguish whether you're looking at the work of an individual or of a large team. So, which am I? I have to acknowledge that I am not an island. In many ways, I stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of the modern tools I have available, the knowledge I have access to, and support from people in my life. But in terms of the direct labor of producing these videos and the projects featured in them, it's just me so far. I do my own project management, research, writing, lighting, camera work, audio, B-roll, editing, animation, motion graphics, closed captions, thumbnails, and I don't generally produce my own background music. I usually pick stuff from YouTube's audio library for a variety of reasons. I don't use any generative AI tools for these tasks, for the record, or for anything else for that matter. I've been trying to squeeze as much as I possibly can out of free resources, my own time, and using what I already have on hand because, well, this is technically monetized, and I'm probably going to finally have to do some taxes about it next spring. At this point, I don't really get paid for any of those jobs. I do want to take a moment to give a shout out, though, to a few lovely folks who have sent one-time or recurring tips my way over the last few months. Y'all have made it possible to pick up a few research materials like books that I couldn't get from the library, as well as a few consumables that go into the production of these videos that I wouldn't really have been able to justify purchasing otherwise, and it really means the world to me. Thank you so much. Anyway, I think in the gap between Norman's "the future is expensive" and "the future is open source" lies the question of what motivates a person or a team to undertake this hard work of design. In the case of business, he's offered us one answer. It's profit. But where does all that leave designs that never sell at all? Ones that are never intended to turn a profit? To help try and make sense of my situation about why I feel so stressed out by the idea of just sharing the files for a thing I've already made, I turned to Nadia Asparuhova's book, Working in Public: The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software. Asparuhova examines, as I looked at earlier, how being used can impact the life cycle of an artifact differently than simply being consumed. However, instead of looking at this from the perspective of the creator's goals as an artist or designer, or as some kind of inherent characteristic of a project, she identifies it as different states that any given project might find itself in: static or active. When a project becomes active through use or audience engagement, it will incur ongoing costs beyond the initial costs of creation and distribution. Who ought to be responsible for shouldering those costs, it turns out, is sort of an unresolved puzzle of the sharing economy. She writes, "Software is frequently characterized as zero marginal cost, meaning that it can be distributed for nearly nothing, regardless of how many additional people consume it. If writing open source code is intrinsically motivated, as Benkler suggests, and if software did actually scale to mass consumption at zero marginal cost, we would have a very tidy situation indeed. But the problem is not quite that simple. Code is nearly free to distribute, but maintenance can still be expensive. Although it's not immediately visible from the code itself, software does incur a hidden set of costs over time. The work of an open source developer goes beyond the initial costs of creation. Maybe developers can't help but make things and share the things they make, but every time they do, and every time they find success, a tiny, invisible clock begins to tick. And they're tasked with managing the care and feeding of their code into perpetuity.
Now, Asparahova is writing here about open source software, but she notes throughout the book that these issues affect many other categories of creator too, especially those who make work for or who have to promote work on social platforms that blur the distinction between public and participatory or broadcast and conversation. I think the overlapping but not identical user interfaces and social conventions of platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitch mean that some people who encounter this video will understand it as a static artifact that they have access to experience, and yes, to have their own personal reaction to, while others will approach it as an interactive, ongoing event that they're participating in and helping to shape. For what it's worth, I don't think either of those is necessarily the default correct way to approach content on a social platform. But conflicts can arise when audience expectations don't align with the author's intentions. For example, a while ago, CJ the X made what I think is a really great video in which they also cite working in public, breaking down a kind of case study of one such conflict that they experienced.
So here's what happened from my perspective. I announced that I'm doing an in-person show in Toronto, and then everyone comments asking me to make it not in person and not in Toronto. This is understandable because I'm speaking to a global audience, most of which, of course, is not in Toronto. And the barrier of entry to the comment section is nothing. And no one has anything to comment unless they're going to the show, except for, God, I wish that were me. I wish it was something else so I could participate. But just because something makes sense and you can see how it happened doesn't make it not annoying. I announced something, and instead of people reacting to the announcement for what it is, they all begged me to live stream it or record it. Of course, to which the answer is no. A live stream or a recording of a live show is not what I offered. No.
I don't know, if I were like king of the internet or something, I would strongly consider making this video required viewing before anyone online gets a license to comment on a stranger's post. Some creators, including many but not all open source maintainers, do very explicitly solicit contributions and feedback, while others don't. But either way, it's worth remembering that even the best case scenario of entirely positive, constructive, and welcome engagement takes time and energy to manage. And I found it really validating that Asparahova not only acknowledges that time and energy are finite resources, but she also explains that those community management tasks constitute a very different type and quality of work than the initial act of creating. And those tasks require different skills. For my part, I do actually feel a bit of anxiety about comments. The vast majority of the feedback I've received so far has been positive, or at least constructive and thoughtful. But every once in a while, there's something really rude or hateful or invasive that just fucking ruins my day, which means that every time I open those notifications, it does feel a little bit like playing Russian roulette. So if you've ever asked a question that sat unanswered for a while, or sent a super thanks that I didn't acknowledge, I'm really sorry. I'm still figuring out how to find a healthy balance on that front. So for those who aren't as familiar with software development or YouTubing or other forms of creative project maintainership, Asparahova provides another analogy.
Our neighbor decorates his house for Christmas because, for whatever reason, he loves to do it. It costs him nothing if others want to enjoy these decorations. But if his neighbors started knocking on his door and putting in requests or telling him how to decorate his house, he'd probably get annoyed and eventually stop putting the decorations up.
Yeah, so the reason I reached out was because I really enjoyed your Black Sheep video, and I noticed at the very end that you said that you had considered, putting the pattern up somewhere on Etsy or something, but then you'd have to support it. I've been thinking a lot lately about where the expectations for certain types of support come from when it comes to releasing the things that we make online. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that and what the sort of key considerations were in that decision of how to release it and to what audience and all of that.
So I have a whole pattern generator website, Abstract Knit Factory, which is a programming joke that nobody ever gets.
This is Carson, a machine knitter and software engineer who frequently combines those skills on her YouTube channel, KnitFactoryImpl. She very kindly agreed to chat with me for this project, even though I'm a total stranger, and I've edited our conversation for time and clarity, mostly because I ramble a lot.
But originally that site was free because I couldn't figure out how to package up the patterns to sell them because it's like JavaScript in the back end and like it wouldn't make any sense. But I've since like changed my mind about the whole, I have a lot of complicated feelings about this. So first I need to acknowledge the privilege here. My bills are paid. My life is comfortable. I don't have to make money off of this in order to like pay my rent. So that like changes the calculation a bit, but also this is a hobby for me. And like I signed up to make some sweaters and write some code. I did not sign up to do customer service. Part of it is the opportunity cost. Like given my experience in my day job and my background, if I were to spend my spare time doing engineering consulting, I'd charge more than a lot of lawyers. And this started out all as like, I was building my own tools for me. And if you go back, I don't remember if the first video was a Python script, but like my first patterns were Python scripts. And like the idea would be you'd go to a GitHub repo, you'd check out the repo, you'd run the Python locally, and you'd get your pattern from that.
Oh,
but that is not really accessible. So I switched to like a website-based React thing to make it a little bit more accessible. So I am like already spending, I'm comfortable volunteering my time and energy to like make this stuff for free because I want to be more accessible and I want to be more available. But I'm essentially like paying money to give stuff away for free because I pay for the hosting costs, I pay for the website.
Like you said, some of the things that I'm making are things that like started out as something for me that I'm now, trying to make available to more people. I'm sort of looking at it going like, okay, how much am I on the hook now for if people find it hard to use, or if it doesn't make sense to them, or if like the documentation that I was able to put together doesn't sort of answer everybody's questions. Like how much am I really responsible for that if it's not a paid product?
And like if a pattern sells for like, I don't know, $5, $10, how much support can you really give for the value that like, you're getting from the payment? But also you can't develop a reputation as like someone who doesn't support their patterns because that's a different thing. But you also can't give people the impression that if they complain a little bit, they always get a refund. So everybody complains, so everybody gets a refund. And there's something in there as well about like the expectations, like gendered expectations, because knitting is a very gendered hobby. And I think women are expected more to give away their time and expertise for free. When I'm giving things away for free and I get all these emails from people, I get emails all the time of like, what does this mean? And these numbers are wrong. I don't answer those.
That's really good to know.
And I don't feel bad about it because they have not paid me any money and I have not, there's like no social contract there that I am going to support this. And I look for like common themes. And if there are common themes, I go and fix bugs. But if it's like a one-off, like, what does this thing mean? And I'm like, there's no way I could explain this more simply. I'm not going to put energy into helping this person. I don't really feel bad about that. Oh, the expectations for a written pattern are very different than a Patreon. Because like with the Patreon, they're kind of buying more access to you. They're buying more parasocial relationship. They're not buying like a thing, like it's not a transaction. It's more of like a general, like, I want to support this person. So I saw a thread a while back. It's kind of a common thing in the knitting community for when someone retires, they wipe the internet of all of their stuff. And it seemed odd to me, like, why is this happening if you can just leave the free stuff out there? And I saw a comment thread where somebody was talking about how they had released a free pattern years ago on the web, and somebody found their work email address and sent them an email asking questions about it. So it's like this lack of boundaries and people still expecting support.
And I mean, I shouldn't be shocked by that because like I know people who are very close to me who are much more experienced in open source than I am, and they get like wild out of the blue demands for their time.
Open source is kind of it's a horse of a different color, because all of the code is there and available. So if somebody asks for something, you can say, okay, here's the file you want to edit, go do it yourself. It's kind of like a passive aggressive patch is welcome. So if people make demands, they can always, and we are not happy with them, they can always fork the whole repo and add their own stuff and like build whatever they want. And part of me wants to open source my pattern library, because to make it a little more accessible, to get like more eyes on it and fixing some of the bugs that have come up. But also when people ask questions, I could just point them to the source code. But also I know that my users aren't going to be able to figure out the source code for the most part. So it'll be tricky. Like, it's available, but they're not going to be able to understand it. So like, how do I deal with that? And also, like, I'm not really proud of the code that I've written. The code for my pattern generator website is shitty code. I like firmly believe that programming is a creative pursuit. But the way that it's taught and the way that it is like productionized as a job leaves no room for that. So when I have time to like step away from my day job, which I sometimes hate, and get back to writing code just for fun, I remember how much I enjoy it.
Reading Working in Public and later talking to Carson about things like the joy of writing shitty code helped me realize that maybe the reason I was having trouble applying most of that creativity unblocking advice is because I wasn't actually having trouble with the creativity part. I didn't, and honestly, very rarely struggle with making the thing. It's sharing it with the expectation of ongoing maintenance that I'm kind of dreading. Not to put too fine a point on it, but I don't want to do maintainer chores or customer support for the Conewinder at all, let alone into perpetuity. I honestly kind of have no love left in my heart for this project, and I really just wish to be freed from its oppressive embrace. At most, I would like to present you with a suite of information and then probably not think about it again for like 2 to 20 years while I wait for the muse of yarn management to kick me in the head again. In other words, I would like to offer you something static for you to take or leave. Like I said, I think there are features which you might reasonably want from a Conewinder, but which are not directly reachable from this Conewinder. And it's not that I don't care about your feedback, it's just that the only way to integrate that feedback in this case would likely be to make pretty much an entirely different thing than what I originally offered you. I just don't want to make that thing right now. But I worry that this will be a pretty difficult boundary to communicate given the acknowledged flaws. I have been on the internet a long time. I've witnessed my share of discourse, and I foresee that to some, it will come across as almost hostile and antisocial to admit to poor design without even the pretense of intention to improve it. Good design, according to these experts I've read, isn't merely a value add. It's presented as a moral imperative. In many minds, user-friendly design is social progress. It's building a better, easier world. Winding yarn isn't life or death stakes, but it's one of the many small inconveniences standing between you and a future of fully automated luxury space convenience, right? How very dare I not do everything in my power to accelerate your comfort? Don Norman writes, "If you have difficulties, remember, it's not your fault. It's bad design. Give prizes to those who practice good design. Send flowers. Jeer those who don't. Send weeds." Thanks, Don. Really looking forward to the hate mail. So if you've been around for a bit, you might note that I have committed to maintaining other projects within reasonable boundaries, like the knitting machine. And you may wonder what the difference is here. One major difference is that, at least for now, I still have a really strong intrinsic motivation to continue developing the knitting machine. I think there's still a lot of really exciting stuff left to do and lots of features that I still want for myself. I released it explicitly as a work in progress with the understanding that even if it's slow, and it is slow, there will be further work, future iterations. Another big difference between the knitting machine and the Conewinder is that because the knitting machine was A, something that I had always intended to open source, and B, originally part of an academic project, I was much more intentional about documenting the process. And to me, the process is where the magic is. See, even if the knitting machine is and forever remains imperfect, I still think there's potentially a lot of value in showing you how it came to be that way, why I made the choices I did, and how I gathered the information I used to come to my conclusions. And I know that some people will only engage with it in terms of the final product, but to me, the joy of sharing that project was much less about the physical artifacts and more about the concepts that led to them. The knitting machine is secretly 3 art projects in a trench coat. And the cone winder just isn't that. Although I've been coaxing this phoenix of meta discussion out of the original concept's smoldering embers, trying to talk about the project more directly felt like all what with very little how or why. Part of that is, of course, because I made it so long ago and I didn't keep very detailed notes. And another part of the problem is that I chose software with a very destructive workflow that doesn't lend itself well to keeping a version history. Without all that insight into the process, all I really have left to offer you is a fairly mediocre product. And I don't think I want to be in the business of marketing products to you. As of the time of writing, I have a relatively small platform. 6,000 subscribers is probably an order of magnitude or two less than what most of us think of as big online, but it's still a slightly terrifying number of people to consider disappointing, or worse, misinforming. So the term influencer has taken on certain connotations, whether you picture a glossy lifestyle goddess delicately applying serums or your favorite down-to-earth YouTuber pitching you a meal delivery service. Sometimes it feels like everyone and everything on the internet is just trying to get you to buy something. Now, I personally haven't taken any sponsorships and I don't plan to, and I don't currently sell any products or merch. I recognize that I'm in an extremely privileged position that I can make that choice and still be able to even entertain the idea of spending time doing this. So I'm not trying to shit on others who do those things to keep the lights on. And, it might be easy to try and distance myself from the whole idea. But I think it's important to remember that influence isn't just limited to spending patterns. The words I say, the worldview that infuses my work, the examples that I set, those all might have ripple effects, and I don't want to take that lightly. For example, I don't want to encourage you to potentially waste a bunch of plastic on a tool you won't like and won't end up using. It's ultimately not up to me to decide whether it's worth it to you, but I should do my best to give you enough information to make an informed decision. So this is not just a question for extremely online personalities. Designers, too, have a moral and ethical obligation to reckon with their own influence. As Norman notes, that design affects society is hardly news to designers. Many take the implications of their work seriously. But the conscious manipulation of society has severe drawbacks, not least of which is the fact that not everyone agrees on the appropriate goals. Design, therefore, takes on political significance. In Western cultures, design has reflected the capitalistic importance of the marketplace. We are surrounded with objects of desire, not objects of use. So for a small fish creator like me, it's not always easy to know in advance how big that impact will be, to predict or control how far any given video or design will spread. There's a very real chance that the things I think I'm performing for a small and familiar audience might unexpectedly get seen by a crowd of strangers 10 times larger. I can dance like nobody's watching, but it would be naive, I think, to pretend that at that scale, some dickheads aren't going to show up complaining about my vocal fry, demanding things I didn't offer, and blessing me with their unsolicited critique. These are people who've been told by their personalized, user-friendly algorithm that my work has been specially selected for their taste. It's for you. And when it turns out that I didn't make something close enough to what they want, I think that will be perceived to be my failing, not the algorithms. The modern user-friendly platform's goal is, to borrow a phrase from Cliff Kwang, not just to make things frictionless, but to make it feel as if you were the only person in the world who mattered. As the visible face of the platform, creators, influencers, whatever we want to call them, us, are also incentivized to make you feel that you're the only person who matters. And I'm starting to think that this contributes to a weird flattening effect I've noticed online. All of the different places we can type text start to feel the same. We can now ask Google for things in the same natural, casual language with which we reply to social media posts. We're all in this big soup together: businesses, celebrities, experts, bots, and ordinary Joes. And I think it's easy to forget that sometimes the text we type into the box is directed to a person and not some kind of corporate information vending machine. There's actually a lot of ambient pressure online to become a kind of influencer, even if you didn't set out to be one. When you share something, anything you've made online, it seems like it's only a matter of time before people start asking for more. If it's something you knit or sewed, you'll get asked for the pattern. If you share a project using one set of materials, you'll get asked how to substitute something completely different. Your makeup looks good in that selfie. What's the brand? Again, a good enough choice for me personally is not necessarily the same as good enough at scale. But that doesn't stop people from asking. As an example, recently I happened to be on Blue Sky, just like right at the moment that a popular creator posted just a little snapshot of something she was proud to have baked for her loved ones. Little tiny personal moment she was sharing, and it took less than a minute for a stranger to ask for the recipe. She's not even in a food-related creative field. But speaking of recipes, lately I have been mildly obsessed with this 2023 New York Times profile of a recipe blogger, Tegan Gerard of Half Baked Harvest, and the subsequent controversy around it. I've probably tried one or two of her recipes over the years because honestly they seem to be pretty ubiquitous, but otherwise I'm not super familiar with Gerard or her brand, and I don't really have strong opinions about whether she's a victim or a villain in this situation. I'm mostly interested in how the discussion paints this kind of fascinating cautionary tableau of what can happen when someone's creative outlet gets warped by an SEO pressure chamber. I think cooking blogs as a category are actually a really interesting example of a lot of the issues I've brought up so far. Cooking a delicious and attractive meal for yourself or your loved ones is a different type of work than photographing and writing a compelling story about it, which is in turn an entirely different type of work than writing and repeatedly testing a technically robust recipe. Plus, like, have you seen the fucking price of eggs? If someone's got to test more than a couple versions of that cake to get it just right, those affiliate links must start to look pretty attractive to offset the cost of ingredients, and oops, now you're a business. And yet another entirely different type of work than fielding comments and support requests, not to mention 1-star ratings from people who don't know how to follow an ingredients list as written, and the endless vitriol from the internet at large who dismiss your personal voice and creative expression as content slop. Why is she forcing us to scroll past all this context? Obviously, we don't want to engage with her as a person. We're here for the useful stuff. Anyway, the thing about the New York Times piece that really stuck with me is the closing quote. Describing the stress she feels facing a barrage of technical questions that fall outside her admittedly limited area of expertise, Gerard says, "How would I know that? I'm not Google." Yeah, fuck it. Let's talk about Google. I mean, not just Google, but they're a convenient place to start. What we call search these days is more of a demand than a struggle to find out what. Give me this, rather than where is this? Joanne McNeil opens her, excellent in my opinion, personal history of the internet, Lurking, How a Person Became a User, with a chapter called Search. While there are a few other once up-to-the-minute online experiences described in the 2020 publication that already feel like echoes from a different world, pour one out for Twitter, the examples in this chapter feel eerily now. Like many, I've been watching in increasing dismay over the past few years as the de facto on-ramp to the information superhighway has degraded to the point where really only the most stubborn and dedicated amongst us make it onto the open road at all. What I hadn't realized is just how long that's been kind of an explicit goal. Remember that quote from earlier? We should be able to give you the right answer just once. We should know what you meant. I mean, it sounds like a pitch for their, in my opinion, infuriatingly useless, wasteful, and intrusive AI overviews. Turns out, that was 2005. Amongst many other diverse ways, Google has been accused of failing to live up to its famous "don't be evil" motto for many years. McNeil describes how Google harvests inquisitiveness. Something so fundamental to being human, the act of having a question. It has so firmly embedded itself inside the experience of learning new things that search, once a word that meant quest, yearning, is now synonymous with Googling. Google has colonized the act of asking a question as it whittles possible answers and influences which is the right one. Now, I don't want to sound alarmist, but I've also been rereading another book, and every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word. After all, what justification is there for a word which is simply the opposite of some other word? Don't you see the beauty in that? A list of hundreds or thousands of potentially relevant documents is a bug, a perceived failure of user-friendly design, because asking the user to choose which of those sources are meaningful to them, to compare and critique and synthesize or reject a diversity of perspectives, is undeniably challenging and time-consuming work. After all, what justification is there for multiple websites representing all that nuance when you could have just one compact summary? This is where knowledge as a service best caters to the younger generations. AI tools and chatbots trained on validated information give Gen Z the quickest, most personalized knowledge, while also giving them the right knowledge.
Should be able to give you the right answer just once. We should know what you meant, so we need to know a lot about you.
Don't you see the beauty in that? Don't you? What neither the consumer nor the purveyor of knowledge as a service ask in those quotes is right answer, right knowledge, according to whom? I mean, Silicon Valley in general and Google in particular has a pretty bad track record when it comes to hiring, representing, and even recognizing people of color as people, for example. So I hope you'll forgive me for being a bit skeptical of their credentials as the arbiters of what's in each of our best interests. We can find several more references to great works of dystopian fiction sprinkled throughout the pages of Cliff Kwong and Robert Fabricant's User-Friendly. Yeah, these guys are back, I told you. From a virtual reality engineer describing how his work was inspired by the world of The Matrix, to the pervasive personalized touchscreen devices on a cruise, which are likened to the setting of the film Minority Report. Now, I thought this book was a pretty fascinating tour through the history of product design, featuring a lot of really interesting stories and insights into the minds of some of the people behind the user experiences we've become accustomed to. I liked the book and I do recommend it, but with at least one largish grain of salt. The authors take a while to build to their conclusion, not that I should talk, which I mostly agreed with, but they don't really seem to acknowledge along the way, let alone critique, the ways that some of their subjects are apparently reading Philip K. Dick like a mail-order catalog. I found this really frustrating at times. I could not tell if they were intentionally using a light touch to allow readers to connect the dots on their own, or if they just genuinely really didn't notice the insidiousness of some of these ideas until much further along in the book's timeline. And I gotta say, this kind of bothers me either way, because sci-fi bedazzled tech visionaries are so notoriously obtuse about this precise issue, reading comprehension, that it's become a popular meme. Although, to be fair to Kwong and Fabricant, their book does predate that tweet by a couple of years, but I think the pattern was already well established enough that we really just needed a catchy name for it. Even if I let them off the hook for not, precogging the Torment Nexus meme, I do still think the book offers plenty of seemingly approving examples of user-friendliness, which rest on, to me, pretty questionable foundations. Like I mentioned earlier, user-friendly is all in on design as a business activity. They do eventually reach an "are we the baddies" sort of conclusion that reckons with some of the ways that capitalistic incentives have perverted our relationships with interactive products. namely with the escalating tendency towards addictive, engagement maximizing apps and the reality distorting scale of companies like Facebook. And they hint at how a flagrant disregard for affirmative consent is, maybe kind of creepy. But they never really stop to question, as far as I could tell, the impulse to enclose, privatize, and charge a monthly subscription for what could otherwise be improved public services available to everyone, like 911 or transit or tax preparation. The other thing I think that neither of these design books really reckon with is the way that user-friendly seamlessness almost seems to demand a monopolistic or at least anti-competitive landscape. Remember that Steve Jobs quote from earlier, "It just works"? Well, when I was trying to dig up a primary source for that, I actually found it via an article about an ongoing antitrust case against Apple, and the author of that article had this to say.
The tricky thing for me is that you might argue that Apple making things work better for its users is anti-competitive because its products don't work as well with third-party devices. That's true. It's also true that Apple absolutely benefits from this integrated design. It does make it harder for people to switch because they would be giving up on that experience. But you can't deny that Apple's way of designing software and hardware together is a better experience for its users, and many of those users intentionally buy its products for that reason. If you force Apple to open up its walled garden in the interest of competition, there's no question that you'll be making the overall experience worse.
Worth noting here that this whole monopoly business is not just one bad apple. Even if I try to set aside the language of capitalism and competitiveness and look for maybe a less, inflammatory word than monopoly, we're left with the idea of standardization. And yeah, even a grumpy old witch like me can concede that there's loads of situations where adopting a widely agreed upon set of standards within a community is pretty essential for society to function at all. But once again, I must ask, who are we allowing to set those standards? Whose ideologies, whose culture, whose languages become embodied in the standard, and who's become marginalized in the name of efficiency? What opportunities and perspectives do you foreclose when, as Jobs put it, everything happens automatically and there's nothing new to learn? The increased adoption of so-called artificial intelligence tools by students, teachers, and educational bureaucracies has turned up the volume on old questions. Who and what is education for? How and why do we learn? What tools help or harm that process?
Audrey Waters writes, "But let's be clear. The rejection of AI is not nostalgia. It is not a longing for some once upon a time of school. Certainly, many educators at both the K-12 and university level say they're experiencing a great sense of loss. Many describe what AI is doing or threatens to do to education using the language of grief. But this isn't a denial of the future. It is grief about a future denied, their students, their own. And so we reject technologies and practices that foreclose thinking, that extract value in both a financial and moral sense, that surveil teaching and learning, that circumscribe agency and freedom, that outsource and privatize, that reduce everything to a transaction to be financialized, optimized, leveraged, controlled. This is about much, much more than AI, but this compulsion to acquiesce to an algorithmic vision of education has raised the stakes and has threatened the very core of what those who are most hopeful, knowing all we know about the flaws of school, see as its possibilities. Education as a practice of freedom."
When I was partway through writing this essay, Abigail Thorne released a new episode of Philosophy Tube. And I'm about to talk about the conclusion of that video, so if you haven't seen it yet and you want to go in fresh, now's your chance to, pause and bounce on over there before I maybe lightly spoil the ending.
Anyway, Abby's video, a little bit like mine, started its journey in the form of a specific creative project she was trying to prepare for public consumption. She'd written a whole video essay centered around a book that she found out at the 11th hour was itself based on a pretty flawed premise. The video ends as a thoughtful reflection on getting things wrong, especially getting things wrong as an educational YouTuber, and how the medium itself has a few limitations and incentives that can contribute to all sorts of information distortion. She identifies yet another area of tension, another identity crisis to add to my list: education versus entertainment.
There's education and there's YouTube. And sometimes those things are in tension. I made this video because I want my audience to be able to sit with that tension. I think it's a useful skill to be able to engage with a piece of media that doesn't get everything right and find some value in it, because that's how we sharpen our critical thinking skills. I mean, today, so much of institutional education is just about trying to get a good grade on the test. And if that's all you care about, then you might as well use the climate-destroying AI plagiarism machine. I mean, who cares? Whatever, right? But I want Philosophy Tube's mission to be bigger than that. I want to make that promise to you that I'm going to keep pushing the limits of what a video essay can be, breaking the limits of a video essay can be, because I don't just want you to like and subscribe. I want you to think.
I don't know if it was just the timing, but the conclusion hit me pretty hard. For one thing, Abby cuts right to the heart of something that I'd been really struggling to articulate about my own work this whole time. That I think even flawed projects can have value, but finding that value demands a lot from the audience. It requires critical thinking and empathy, skills which are often disincentivized or even suppressed by the tools we use to gather and exchange information. This search for meaning, for value, is not a user-friendly experience, but I do think it's a worthwhile one. I think most importantly, it was Abby's reminder of why she started Philosophy Tube in the first place that prompted me to revisit my own motivations. I mean, why video? Why YouTube? Why these videos? So, like Philosophy Tube and a lot of other YouTubers, I had the good fortune to be able to go out and get a formal education, and then I felt a little bit compelled to try to share it. I also think maybe I wasn't quite ready to give up being able to devote so much of my time to just learning for learning's sake. As I listened to Abby talk about wanting to give her education away for free, I realized that the very last students to ever graduate with the same degree as me would have just sat their final examinations only a few days before. The somewhat esoteric program I'd studied had been scrapped in favor of a newer choice of career-tailored specialties delivered through a more modern and more expensive edtech platform. It's no longer possible to get my education at any price, except insofar as someone like me shares it. Although in truth, I think that might always have been the case. Even if they hadn't canceled my program, most of the courses I found most valuable had a lot of self-directed components, and many of the ideas that still burn brightest in my mind required really reading between the lines of the course texts and reaching beyond the required reading. Now, in my case, that program also left me with a stack of creative work that I was really proud of, and I wanted to create a bit of a portfolio. A blog or a static gallery would have been way less work, but most of my projects in some way ended up being time-based. They're made of code and sound, and they move or change, so that really demands a presentation medium that's also time-based. Motion pictures, baby! And of course, where does one put video online? Anyway, it's probably clear by now that I enjoy putting on a show. I've been a working performing artist for almost my entire life, and recently I haven't really had access to the same outlets for that theater kid energy that I used to. So, if nothing else, I'm just here trying to keep myself entertained. I do have a bit of a harder time thinking of myself as an educator, though, because, like I said earlier, I don't ever really feel like an expert.
so much of what I want to share is stuff that I'm still really in the process of learning myself. There's a reason this channel is called Sparks Curiosity and not, say, Sparks' one-stop top-down knowledge emporium. But yeah, I do hope that my work has educational value. And the things I hope you take away are not specific facts, like the dimensions of a particular knitting machine needle, or even techniques like how to do a faux Russian join, or the project plans for a knitting machine or a cone winder. Those are cool, but to me, they're not really the point. The point is that, yes, underneath those tools, there is stuff to learn. And that's not a bug, it's a feature. It's fucking exciting. So when I say this next part, I really want you to understand that I am fighting against the conditioning of decades of working in public-facing customer support roles and even more decades of existing in a feminized body. I don't think I'm here to make your life easier. And that's not because I don't think you deserve ease in your life. I do. I want you to have genuine rest and leisure and safety and assistance in accomplishing your goals. But I don't think me chasing the particular type of design that I've described the cone winder failing at is really going to make a meaningful dent in those things. I just think I don't really want to build a niche around what Cliff Kwong refers to as industrialized empathy. I don't think that's where my strengths lie. I mean, this is my teleprompter remote. I clearly have an unusually high tolerance for hacky workarounds. And to be honest, it's just not going to make me happy. I don't want to produce things that disappear seamlessly and frictionlessly into the background of your life. I want the things I put into the world to encourage you to think more, not less. So I've decided that I'm here to be a pain in the ass. Whether you consider yourself a consumer or a producer of tech or both, I want to slow you down long enough that you have time to wonder why. I'm here to be a tiny grain of sand in the gears of a dystopian progress juggernaut which insists that the pinnacle of user experience is for a large corporation with the money and power of an empire to think your thoughts for you in advance, to know you better than you know yourself, to relieve you of that difficult chore, you see, the burden of thinking about who you are and what you want and why you want it and what the consequences of getting it will be, because that's efficient. Don Norman does describe one subgenre of design where the usual rules are purposefully broken and the designer's role is to create intentionally challenging scenarios. Game design. Play. And while he only addresses it in passing, he also alludes to another related, I think, subversive use of carefully deployed friction. There's even an example right here on the cover. Art. Abby's video reminded me that whatever other roles I may or may not choose to take on along the way, educator, influencer, maintainer, business bozo, designer, I came here to make art. So I'm going to take Cam's advice from earlier, and I'm going to share something bad on purpose. If you still want them, the files for the cone winder will be available for free on my Patreon page in their current imperfect state. I encourage you to think of it like a puzzle to solve, like a game, like art. In order to get something from it, you will have to put some of yourself into it. There will be minimal documentation, no detailed demonstrations, and no technical support. When I last worked on it, I made some relatively small but still potentially buggy changes to a couple of parts that I haven't yet printed and tested, so we're still very much in the here be dragons part of the map. I will not be soliciting feedback or taking feature requests, but you are welcome to adapt the design as it suits you, or use it as a conceptual springboard for something entirely different. My one last little caveat is that I really don't want you to use a bunch of plastic printing something that won't end up getting used.
If you're considering building your own cone winder, I really strongly urge you to spend a bit of time pondering the parts and their digital representation before you go to print them. Like, try to build up a mental model of how the machine is going to work and whether or not that'll realistically suit your purposes. On the other hand, if you're considering building one for someone else, probably sit down with them and find out a bit more about their yarn management needs before you commit your time and materials to this project. Even setting aside all of the relative user unfriendliness issues I've described in this video, which mean this cone winder might not be everyone's cup of tea, you'll want to double check whether your favorite yarn hoarder even wants or needs to wind their yarn onto cones at all. Like, I have seen some rare examples of people hand knitting from cones, but it's much more likely that hand knitters and even some machine knitters will get more use out of a ball winder. That's an entirely different and much more widely available tool. I personally don't weave or crochet, so I don't know whether this fits into your workflow. I'm sorry, but I wish you success in all your yarn wrangling tasks either way. In Working in Public, Nadia Asparahova discusses how important it is to the sustainability of open source overall for maintainers to be able to step away from a project. And I think this is a crucial part of that bigger task of building an open source future that Don Norman described. Understanding that knowledge production doesn't have to look like an individual or a team or a company just sprinting or marathoning their way to some kind of monopoly on the next best thing. I was going to say it's a relay, but I don't actually think that's right either. I don't really want to compare it to a race at all. As for me, I'm going to keep wandering out on my little quests, and I will be coming back with snapshots and souvenirs and maybe even a few complete maps. But it's important to remember that those things aren't equivalent to having gone on the journey. I want to invite you to go on an adventure. It doesn't have to be my adventure. Mine's just an example. I'm here to remind you to value the search. In a world that's constantly encouraging you to do otherwise, I want you to stay curious.